Garming is a 4-star pyro DPS that has both a really cool idle animation and an extremely unique playstyle. Despite it being nearly 2 years now since its release, Garming still holds up as one of the best pyro DPSs in the game, and definitely a character that is still worth building, especially if you have him on high constellations. This guide will be structured into 5 parts. First, I will cover Garming's kit and playstyle, and give some general tips on optimizing the number of skills you can cast during his burst. Second, I will quickly go through his constellations and point out the ones that are most impactful for his damage. In the third section, I will go over Garming's recommended artifact sets and the amount of energy recharge you should go for, along with pointing out some potential mistakes that I see people make during his artifact selections. Fourth, I will discuss Garming's weapon choices, and finally, in the fifth section, I will go over some team comps that you can play Garming in. At the end of the video, I will also have a bonus farming guide that you can follow, so if you just pulled Garming from a banner and don't know where to start when building him, then make sure to stick around to the end. If you find this video helpful in any way, please do consider subscribing and supporting my relatively small YouTube channel. With that being said, let's begin with going through Garming's kit and his playstyle. Garming is a character that deals most of his damage through a special form of plunge attack activated by his skill. Pressing his skill will cause Garming to pounce forwards and leap into the air if he comes into contact with an enemy or a surface. Using a plunge attack immediately following this will cause Garming to use the especially powerful plunging attack Charmed Cloud Strider instead. When this plunge attack lands, Garming will consume a fixed amount of HP that won't go below 10% of his total HP. Although this special plunge is activated by his skill, it is important to note that the damage caused by the plunge is still considered as plunging damage, and thus won't scale off of skill damage. His skill has a cooldown of 6 seconds and generates 2 particles per hit. For his burst, using his burst will cause Garming to launch his companion Manzai into his enemies, dealing a single instance of AoE pyro damage. His burst will also cause Garming to enter his burst state, the Wushu stance. In this state, Garming's resistance to interruption is increased significantly, and additionally will cause each one of Garming's successive skill casts to also summon Manzai as long as he is above 50% HP. When the summoned Manzai relinks up with Garming, the cooldown for Garming's skill will be refreshed, allowing you to use it again. This is the core mechanic of Garming's kit, which is to enter his burst state and spam AoE plunge attacks using his skill. Normally, Garming's burst allows you to use his skill up to around 7 times. However, it is important to note here that the refresh on Garming's skill is not on a set time interval, but rather fully dependent on how fast you link up with Manzai. This means that if you run away or dash in the opposite direction to where Manzai is launched, the refresh of your skill will be longer and you won't get as much hits in. So when you're actually playing Garming in combat, as both you and your enemies will be dashing and running around constantly, realistically, Garming will only get around 5 to 6 skill casts during his burst. One way to maximize this number is to run in the direction of where Manzai is launched so that the link up occurs quicker. While the direction at which Manzai is launched is dependent on RNG, it isn't entirely random. In fact, Manzai can only be launched to either the left or right of Garming and never directly in front or behind. By paying attention to where Manzai is launched and dashing immediately towards him, you can get up to 6 to 7 skill casts each rotation, but this won't always be consistent. A more reliable way of doing this is by timing your plunge attacks to where you pick up Manzai during your attack animation. This is made possible as Manzai is only generated after a plunge attack lands. Here, you can see me picking up Manzai mid-air just before my plunge attack is about to finish. By doing this, we can effectively refresh Garming's skill instantly each time, allowing you to get 7 or even 8 skills off each cycle. As a final note to Garming's kit, while his special plunge attacks are still considered as plunge damage, the actual damage itself is scaled off of his skill and not his normal attack levels. Therefore, the priorities of talent leveling should be his skill followed by his burst and then normal attacks. Next, let's quickly go over Garming's Ascension passives and constellations. Garming's Ascension 1 passive, which unlocks at level 20, allows Garming to regain 1.5% of his max HP every 0.2 seconds for 0.8 seconds each time his skill plunge attack hits an opponent. His Ascension 4 passive, which unlocks at level 60, gives Garming a 20% incoming healing bonus when his HP is below 50% and a 20% damage increase to his skill plunge when his HP is above 50%. For constellations, the main ones you're going to want to look out for are his 3rd, 4th, and 6th constellations. Unfortunately, Garming is quite a constellation dependent unit. While he definitely is still good without them, having some of his constellations, especially C4, can make your Garming feel a lot nicer to play. In brief, Garming C1 allows Garming to heal 15% of his max HP each time Manzai links up with Garming. C2 gives Garming a 5-second 20% attack increase if any incoming healing overflows above his max HP. C3 increases his skill level by 3, which is obviously important as that is his main source of damage. C4 gives Garmin 2 energy each time his special skill punch hits an enemy, which can greatly reduce Garmin's energy recharge requirements, as I will discuss further in the artifact section. C5 increases his burst level by 3, and finally, Garmin's C6 increases his skill's plunging attacks crit rate by 20% and crit damage by 40%, and also increases the attack radius of his plunge AoE. This final 6th constellation is a tremendous buff to Garmin's overall DPS, and is one that really elevates him to being a competitive on-field DPS on par with even some of the 5-star carries. In addition, as we will get into more detail later, this constellation is also an important factor to consider when choosing his best artifact set and weapon options. Garmin's artifact choices are quite flexible, with there being 4 viable options that all works really well on him. In general, 4-piece Crimson Witch of Flames and 4-piece Maréchaussée Hunter are going to be your best in slot options. Which one is best for your Garmin will be dependent on the weapon and team you play him in. However, in general, both sets have rather similar performances, and there is not one that is just outright better than the other. So if you already have a good Maréchaussée or Crimson Witch, then there really is little benefit to justify farming for a whole new set. The other 2 artifact sets that can work just as well for Garmin are the Lone Knight's Oath and Gilded Dreams. If you're someone just starting out and can't farm 5-star artifacts yet, then you can consider using 4-piece Berserker, 4-piece Instructor, or 4-piece Braveheart. Now, despite what the recommended artifact tab in Genshin might lead you to believe, let's talk about why Maréchaussée is not just outright the best artifact set for Garmin. First, let's talk about why Crimson Witch of Flames is a competitive set to Maréchaussée. The 4-piece effect of Crimson Witch of Flames greatly increases Garmin's elemental reaction damage when he triggers Melt or Vaporize. By using your skill 3 times, Garmin's pyro damage will additionally be increased by 22.5%. The obvious drawback to this is that to get the optimal damage from this set, you do need to use 3 elemental skills first. However, just the elemental reaction damage bonus that this set provides justifies Crimson Witch as a comparable set to Maréchaussée. This is because the 15% damage bonus from Melt and Vaporize provided by the set is directly added to the elemental mastery bonus multiplier. Here, my Garmin has an elemental mastery of 238, which increases my Melt and Vaporize damage by 40.4%. Having the 4-piece effect of Crimson Witch of Flames increases this multiplier to 55.4%, which in the case of my Garmin equates to an increase of elemental mastery of around 111. But wouldn't having 36% crit rate bonus still be better? In some cases, yes. However, Maréchaussée does have a few major drawbacks. First, the 2-piece bonus that Maréchaussée gives is completely useless for Garmin, as the 15% damage increase does not apply to Garmin's plunge attacks. Second, depending on the team and weapon you run Garmin in, you may not actually get the full bonus of the 4-piece effect. On his own, while Garmin's skill will cause his HP to decrease and increase, which triggers the 4-piece effect of Maréchaussée, this occurs only after a plunge attack lands. This means that both his burst and initial plunge attacks in his rotation will not have the crit rate bonus. Obviously, this will not be an issue if you have Farina on his team. However, this does bring me to the biggest potential issue of using Maréchaussée, and that is crit rate overcapping. Garmin is a character that has multiple sources of crit rate bonuses that can very easily lead you to overcap above 100%. For example, Shen Yun, who is one of Garmin's best supports, provides an additional 10% crit rate to all plunging attacks. If your Garmin is C6, then your skill plunges will have an additional 20% crit rate. If your Garmin is in a melt team, Cryo Resonance also provides 15% crit rate. On top of all of this, a lot of Garmin's best weapon choices, like Serpent Spine and Fruitful Hook, also offers crit rate. With all this in mind, I'm sure you can see why the 36% crit rate provided by Maréchaussée can start to lose value. Sorry if this section was a little long. I hope this at least clears up some confusion around the artifact choices for Garmin, as I see a lot of people using Maréchaussée without considering its potential drawbacks. Now, let's talk a little bit about the recommended artifact stats. For the main stats on your sands, I would generally recommend prioritizing Elemental Mastery. The reason why I would go for Elemental Mastery over attack percent is because Garmin is a character that already has a lot of sources of attack bonuses, especially if you run him with Bennett or Shen Yun, or even both. In the case of Shen Yun specifically, as she gives additional damage bonuses to Garmin's plunge attacks based on her own attack and not Garmin's, using an attack percent sands on your Garmin will only buff a portion of his plunge damage. On the other hand, all of Garmin's plunge damage, including buffs from Shen Yun, will be buffed by Elemental Mastery. Thus, especially in teams with Shen Yun, Elemental Mastery on your sands is going to be a much better option. For the circlet, I would recommend going for crit rate or crit damage. If you're using Maréchaussée, then crit damage will likely be the better option, depending on whether you're hitting that 100% crit rate cap or not. And finally, for the goblet, pyro damage bonus is going to be your best option. Generally, for your artifact substats, prioritize reaching his energy recharge requirements first, then aim for crit rate and crit damage, then Elemental Mastery, then finally attack percent. On the topic of substats, let's quickly discuss Garming's energy recharge requirements. Garming's burst costs 60 energy and has a cooldown of 15 seconds. His skill generates him 2 particles, however, there is an internal cooldown in its particle generation, meaning that in his burst state, only about every second plunge attack will actually generate him particles. This unfortunately does mean that Garming will have quite high energy requirements. Ideally, you should aim for a minimum of around 140 to 150% energy recharge to get his burst back comfortably. However, your energy needs can be greatly reduced depending on whether you have Garming's C4 and the teams you play him in. As mentioned previously, Garming's C4 provides an additional 2 energy restoration each time his plunge hits an enemy, which can decrease your Garming's energy needs by 25 to 35%. In addition, if you have a Favonius user on the team, Bennett, or other off-field particle generating characters, then Garming's energy needs can be lowered to just 110 to 120%. With the artifacts now out the way, let's quickly talk about Garming's best weapon choices. In terms of weapons, Garming is in an interesting position as he doesn't have any great 5-star choices. This means that his best weapons, in a lot of cases, is actually going to be a 4-star. Namely, a high refinement Serpent Spine and a high refinement Fruitful Hook are usually going to be your best in slot options. However, it is important to keep in mind, again, that both these weapons will boost Garming's crit rate, so do take care not to overcap. There is, however, another problem with these two weapons, and that is that they are very free to play unfriendly. Serpent Spine, being a Battle Pass exclusive weapon, is literally unobtainable unless you buy the Battle Pass. Fruitful Hook, being a gacha weapon, is also very hard to get to high refinements. While this is the case, the good news is that there are still some very good free-to-play options that can still be great on Garming. These include the Mailed Flower and Rain Slasher, which are both great options to further boost your Garming's elemental mastery. If you don't have any of these, then the craftable Tidal Shadows and Blackcliff Slasher, which is in a Stark Glitter exchange, can also be good backups. If you are someone just starting out, then consider using the Blood Tainted Greatsword as a good beginner's option. For Garming's 5-star weapon choices, you're mainly just going to be using them as a stat stick of either crit rate or crit damage. Some of these include 1,000 Blazing Suns, Redhorn Stone Thresher, The Verdict, among many others. For non-crit rate 5-star options, the Wolf's Gravestone and the Unforged can also work quite well. However, in general, a Refinement 1 5-star stat stick will still just be slightly behind on damage compared to an R5 Serpent Spine or Fruitful Hook. Now on to the last section of the video, and that is the teams you should play Garming in. Garming has 2 major team archetypes that you can play, with those being Melt or Vaporize. Mono Pyro teams are generally not that recommended for Garming, as he does have an extremely reaction-centered playstyle, so I would generally try to avoid those. First, let's talk about his melt teams. Melt teams are generally going to be the best for Garming's personal damage. In most melt teams, Xlotolight will almost always be the best option for your off-field cryo application. But if you don't have Xlotolight, other characters like Rosaria can also work. For the last flex slot, Shenyun, Silonin, other amino supports such as Kazuha, and a secondary cryo character can all work great. In general, Garming's melt teams are quite flexible and easy to build, but for the highest damage ceilings, you do need to run Xlotolight. Now, if you don't have Xlotolight or other cryo characters built, the alternative team comp will be to use Vaporize. These teams, however, can be a lot more restrictive, as for Vaporize to work well with Garming, you are going to need to use Farina as an off-field hydro applicator. The reason why you can't really use Xingqiu or Yelan to fill this role is because, in general, you won't be using any normal attacks during your rotation to trigger their abilities. In addition, having Farina on your team will also enable more uptime on Maui Shosei if your Garming is using it, which can also help with his DPS. One of the best Vaporized teams for Garming, and my personal favorite, is Garming, Farina, Shenyun, and Bennett. Shenyun both heals and buffs Garming's plunge attack damage, while Bennett at C6 can give your Garming an additional pyro damage bonus. In addition, C6 Bennett will also infuse your Garming's plunge attacks with pyro, which along with Shenyun, can enable you to weave in some normal plunge attacks during your rotation. Variations of this team can include switching out either Shenyun or Bennett for other supports such as Shilonin or Yansan, or a secondary hydro character like Yelan or even Sijun. Well, again, I wouldn't really recommend playing Garming outside of either Melt or Vaporize teams. If you do want to run him in an alternative team comp, then using Cheverus and Yansan and Fischl in an Overload team, or Xiangling, Bennett, and a Flex slot in a Mono Pyro team can also work. That is going to be all for this Garming guide video. Thank you very much for watching till the very end. On screen now is a farming schedule that I made for Garming to get you started if you just pulled him from a banner. Overall, while you do really need his 4th and 6th constellations and good supports to make him one of the best DPSs in the game, even without them, Garming can still be an extremely strong and fun character to play. If you found this guide in any way helpful, please consider giving the video a like, and if you do enjoy the content that I make and the quality of the video, then please do also consider subscribing as well.